Hi everybody, welcome back to Capricorn Radio. This is your host James, and I'm delighted to be talking to a super interesting guy today. We're going to be talking to Carl Lehrburger. And for those that know about Carl, a little bit about him before I bring him on. He has studied archaeological and sacred sites in North America with a focus on ancient world peoples in America before Columbus for more than 25 years. He has published articles on rock art sites in Ancient American magazine, a renewable energy entrepreneur, avid traveller and explorer. He lives in Talent, Oregon. For more information on the book and the author, visit newhistoryofamerica.com. So we're going to get into a little more of Carl's bio before we get into the book. But the book today is super exciting. Secrets of Ancient America, Archaeoastronomy and the Legacy of the Phoenicians, Celts and Other Forgotten Explorers. It delves into the real history of the New World and the visitors both East and West, who travelled to America long before 1492, the fabled visit by Columbus. So, without further ado, let's bring on today's guest. Hi, Carl. You're very welcome to the show.
Hi, James, and greetings to Capricorn Radio listeners around the world.
Thank you, Carl. And yeah, wow, super exciting today. Super exciting to have you here, Carl. And you know, nice to see Newgrange and my part of the world focused on in the book as well. I'm so excited, Carl. But before we get into any of that, and I love the book, by the way, absolutely love that. One of my favourite books I've reviewed this year, Carl, by the way. But before we get into that, Carl, it's always about the author first. We kind of have a similar background in renewable energy, so although mine was a bit of an industrial engineering route, but I'm fascinated with renewables. Tell me about that part of your life, Carl. This is incredibly interesting to see you perhaps this is the analytical, creative mind looking at the problems of what we're going to talk about today, but in a vocation sense.
Oh, well, thank you for that great introduction. And I'm glad to begin this interview by talking a little about my background in renewable energy. Because it really provides, I think, the reader a perspective that I've taken a scientific approach, and not just like many scholars and authors on the topic of the ancients from Europe and the Mediterranean visiting America long before Columbus. My teachers really have been grounded in engineering science, and I've tried to bring a very critical eye to looking at the diffusionism in America, and especially being able to document the evidence, so that it's very clear that we're not talking about, in many instances, suppositions, but in fact we're talking about events that did occur and have evidence. And by way of background, I've been working in the renewable energy area for over 40 years, including work in solar energy, waste management, and recycling, and most recently in biorefining, that is taking non-food biomass like corn stalks and agricultural residues and converting them into a whole array of bioproducts, ranging from pulp and paper products to specialty chemicals, nutraceuticals, and even biofuels. Most recently, you'll find this interesting, James, we founded a subsidiary company, Pure Hemp Technology, which is focused entirely on processing industrial hemp, not marijuana, but industrial hemp, into a new generation of hemp-based products. As you may know, the mood in the United States is rapidly changing, as many states led by Oregon and Colorado have legalized marijuana, and over 22 states are now starting production of industrial hemp, a very strong industry right up till 1930s in the United States when it was banned. So it's almost back to the future, and we are pursuing the biorefining of industrial hemp. Just to provide the listeners with additional information if they choose, more information on Pure Vision can be found at purevisiontechnology.com, and more information on our efforts to scale up a biorefining technology for industrial hemp can be found at purehemptech.com, P-U-R-E, hemp, T-E-C-H.com.
Oh, wonderful, Carl. And yeah, that's incredibly fascinating, and it's a lucrative product as well. I mean, people don't realize how versatile hemp is. I mean, there was probably no need for half our plastics industry. I mean, it's so versatile. You can make clothing out of it. It's extremely strong fiber. And the problem has been because of the associated cannabis plant that it's really inhibited the use of industrial hemp. It seems bizarre and crazy that that's the way our society has gone, but it's that legalization process will open the doors for industrial hemp. Fascinating area of research, Carl.
Well, thank you, and it's I think it's a new day here in America.
Yeah, for sure. Great to see that science background, Carl. This is very pertinent to what we're going to talk about today, archaeoastronomy. Before we get into details, I mean, you know what? I actually think archaeoastronomy in certain circumstances is more accurate than some of the archaeological dating. I mean, archaeoastronomy is a very specific dating tool, Carl.
Well, it certainly can be, and I think the European perspective somewhat predates the Americans right now in understanding that archaeoastronomy is really one of the major languages of the ancients. And for so long, we've had archaeologists traveling the Americas, looking down and digging and looking for artifacts without looking up and understanding that the ancients encoded many of their monuments as well as their petroglyphs with archaeo and astronomical information that is very revealing, not only in terms of potentially the dating, but most importantly the culture and the origins of the inscribers of these petroglyphs and the builders of these monuments. Unlike Europe, where we have a tremendous amount of monumental structures that encode archaeoastronomy, including Stonehenge and Newgrange, which I feature in the book. In America, while we do have some monumental examples of old world peoples building monuments and large structures that have archaeoastronomical aspects to them, most of what we see here in North America are petroglyphic archaeoastronomy. Sure. That is, that the sun and shadow play at specific times of year, including the equinoxes and the solstices, and of course the cross-quarter days, which we'll talk about a little later, are encoded in petroglyphs. And in some cases, we actually see what I call in the book heliolithic animations, or light shows, where the dancing and moving shadows and light show up on these petroglyphs to reveal a story. So it's a very exciting new tool over here in America in which to reevaluate a lot of the rock art that heretofore has all been considered to be done by the Native Americans. When in the case of Secrets of Ancient America, the book, I've been able to document a scant, although maybe a dozen or so instances where the rock art does have old world origins.
Incredible, Carl. Love the book, by the way. Beautiful book, so much in it, Carl. I mean, it must have took you quite a while to compile all this stuff.
Well, it was about 20 years of research and field work and 7 years of writing. Barry Fell, Dr. Fell was a biologist at the Harvard Museum, and he first wrote a book on diffusionism called American BC in 1976. and went on to write several other books. But in many instances, we consider Dr. Fell as one of the towering figures of American diffusionism. And in America, BC, he documented the evidence that old world travelers, including Minoans, Phoenicians, and Celts, made it to the New World and, in fact, left their mark and left evidence here. I read the book 10 years after it was published in 1986, and it just ignited a passion for trying to hold on what is our history, and if Dr. Fell was correct, why has it been covered up for Americans? So there's a huge story that Dr. Fell ignited, and not just in my case as a researcher, but many of the diffusionist scholars in America really got their starting point by reading Dr. Fell, a very controversial figure.
Oh, for sure. And just to point out for the listeners, we're going to get into some Celtic, Hebrew, Roman, early Christian, Templar, Egyptian, Chinese, and Japanese influences in North American artifacts and ruins. Carl, this is an insane amount of influence into pre-Columbus America. I mean, it's absolutely insane, but it's like we have to just rewrite the history books, literally, Carl. We just got to scrub out what we got and just start again.
You know, it is incredible to think that most people still, in America at least, still think Columbus discovered America. And while the Geo priest, the antagonist in my book, including the archaeological community, might acknowledge that, you know, some of the Norsemen and Vikings might have made it to America before Columbus, they are so quick to disavow any connection with transatlantic or trans-Pacific travels, not just hundreds, but literally thousands of years before Columbus. So certainly the book builds toward the end of why has our history been so disguised, and why have we been lied to about our history, and what is it going to take to change the paradigm? I mean, people in Europe probably recognize that even today, Americans still celebrate Columbus Day every year as a national holiday. So there's a lot of reconstruction, not only in the archaeological area, but also in the educational areas of North America.
Dying to get to the archaeoastronomy, but let's focus on Columbus for a moment. I mean, there's the accepted story of Columbus, and then there's the real story of Columbus. Now, I know you spent a bit of time with this at the start, which I think is pertinent, because I think if you're going to talk about anything else other than Columbus, at least you got to address that question. And I like that you do that, Carl, because a lot of people, you know, they focus this stuff and they miss the point, because this has to be a book for everybody, Carl. And if you're going to meet people that are still attached to the Columbus mythology, well, then you're going to have to address that question for those. And I've seen enough evidence, Carl, myself, to say that, you know, the Columbus scenario, he was probably the last person to discover America, but in a long line of people. But I mean, let's address the Columbus, because I know you said there's a different story to Columbus that we actually probably know.
Well, I've concluded what you just articulated, that Columbus was not first but last of a long line of explorers that made it to America. You know, we're told that Columbus was seeking a passage to India or to the east, and I've concluded that that's a total fiction. That Columbus knew about America. He knew where he was going. He knew how long it would take to get there, and we can suggest that he knew about America from two different sources. The first source was the many maps that were left by Arabs when they abandoned the libraries that had been assembled in Toledo, Spain. Mm-hmm. And you know, a lot of information was coming out after the Arabs left, including literature and science, and but we don't hear too much about the maps. And it's quite clear that Christopher Columbus and his brother Bartholomew not only had access to those maps, but that but they were able to acquire them. In fact, it said that when Columbus died, he had tens of thousands of different maps. So he had a very good idea from Arab maps of the existence of North America. But interestingly enough, he also, through his wife, Philippe, who had intermarried with the very famous Drummond Sinclair family of Henry Sinclair, the Prince of Orkney Islands, who traveled to the Americas in the 11th and 12th century. So from that side of the family, he certainly had the stories, if not actual documentation. So I think it's pretty obvious that he knew about the trade currents and how to get to and from America, how long the journey would take. And what the conclusion of the Columbus mythology is that the Columbus myth disguises that Columbus was really the first one to establish slavery in the Americas, and in doing so instigated the genocide of Native Americans along with the confiscation of their lands. And this is, I think, the central reason why we still have the Columbus myth to disguise, what has become the creed of America, a manifest destiny. So it's been institutionalized in the form of Columbus Day, and part of a new history of America is really taking a myth and being able to establish what the Columbus really instigated here in America.
Sure, Carl. Let's go straight into archaeoastronomy, Carl. I mean, for me, Chaco Canyon, Carl, Chaco Canyon, incredible architecture, petroglyphs there. For me to see spirals with astronomical alignments is a no-brainer for me, Carl. This is the language that I understand from Ireland. I grew up with books with Martin Brennan, and I know Martin Brennan's a hero of mine and a colleague of yours. So, Carl, we're on an awesome meeting ground today. Let's tell us about Martin Brennan, his pioneering work, spirals, petroglyphs, the links with ancient America.
Well, it's great always to run into people who know Martin, a dear friend. And I early on in the book, before jumping into what's going on here in America, did my best to provide an overview to archaeoastronomy in Europe, featuring a lot of Martin's work at Newgrange to really set the stage for the diffusion of a lot of archaeoastronomy techniques that are found really throughout Europe, but especially in Ireland and England, and to document how that knowledge diffused or traveled to the Americas. And we see, first of all, Celtic influences in New England that can be seen in monumental architecture at a site called America Stonehenge in southern New Hampshire, where they have these very large stone that align with the various equinoxes, solstice, and cross-quarter days. And these standing stones can be observed from a central point in the large complex that includes stone chambers and exhaustive stonework that clearly had its roots not in Native American culture, but in a Celtic culture. And we know this not only because of the documentation of cross-quarter days. Those are those very special celebratory days of the Celts that fall between the equinoxes and the solstices. As an example, Beltane or Beltana, which celebrates the sun god Bel, falls in early May and come down to us as May Day. But we find in a very monumental sense, like we see in European structures and monuments how the ancient Celts used archaeoastronomy both as a calendrical device of being able to anticipate when these special days occurred, but also as a cultural means of celebrating these special days. As I referred to, archaeoastronomy is the language of the ancients, and it's not obviously limited to the Celts or Old World peoples from Europe and the Mediterranean, but includes the people from Asia as well as greater Indus Valley, and that in America we see extensive archaeoastronomical occurrences from the ancestors to the Native Americans. And this is a great time to say that while there are thousands of petroglyph sites in North America and millions of petroglyphs, probably more so here than anywhere in the world, only a very few really we can say originated or were carved by Old World peoples, especially Celts who left their mark in Ogham or Ohm, a writing system used by the Celts. So I don't want to leave the impression for our listeners that that most of the rock art was from the Old World peoples. In fact, quite the contrary. Just a scant number of great examples prove that they were here. But predominantly, we see the archaeoastronomy in the ancestors of the Native Americans, and you cite Chaco Canyon as an example, and Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, the ancients not only built their structures with the equinoxes and the position of the sun as a central feature, but they also in the petroglyphs themselves things like circles that were aligned to equinoxes, whether they be sunset equinox or a sunrise equinox alignment. We find this not only in the later day Native Americans like Chaco Canyon, but even going earlier than that throughout Great Basin and in other locations. So now in America, as archaeoastronomy is beginning to be accepted as a legitimate field of study, more and more of these of the knowledge of the ancients and their capabilities and their messages are being revealed. However, the archaeopriesthood, if you will, that is the status quo archaeologists, often dispel archaeoastronomy and astronomers and their work as not being scientific. But I think this paradigm is changing, and as we move forward in revealing a new history of America and get a new generation of archaeologists, anthropologists, epigraphers involved in looking at the evidence, we're going to see a greater reliance on archaeoastronomy than we've seen in the past.
For sure, Carl. I had Dennis Stone on before to talk about America's Stonehenge. A lovely guy, very passionate guy, and very articulate. Incredibly exciting monument to America's Stonehenge. Not to be confused with the replica that's up in Washington State, I believe. It's called Mary Hill Stonehenge. There's an actual replica of Stonehenge up there, but not to be confused with that one. There's what's dubbed America's Stonehenge on the east coast of America. Incredibly interesting structures, that part of the world too, Carl. All the Newgrange type chambers or alignments up there as well. Maybe just focuses on the chambers. What's your take on the chambers, Carl? They call them root cellars, but I mean, they're so sophisticated, Carl.
Well, I'm glad Dennis Stone, because there's been such a great preservation effort at America's Stonehenge that now it's one of the few public places that people can come and really see evidence that tells we're here, including in their museum some stones with Ogham writing on it. And it was in the late 80s and early 90s that I was living in New England when I read Barry Fell's book and met Martin Brennan, and we had an opportunity to visit some of these Celtic sites in Vermont, in New Hampshire, and Massachusetts together, and it was an awesome experience to be doing that with Martin, who had spent decades looking at megalithic chambers in Ireland and documenting archaeoastronomical phenomena and interpreting the megalithic petroglyphs that have been left. So it was really an exciting time to be exploring. And you're absolutely right. In addition to Stonehenge in southern New Hampshire, there are hundreds of smaller stone chambers with an orientation usually to the east for equinox sunrises, and you can almost say dot the New England landscape. So the archaeologists consider these to be colonial structures, not made by old world people, but as often call them root cellars. But I think that this is far from the truth, and that we have a legacy of Celtic explorers in New England building chambers and having sites like America's Stonehenge and other sites in Vermont, including Calendar 1 and Calendar 2, that show how well entrenched the Celts were in the New England area, perhaps driven by earlier expeditions to the interior of North America, specifically in the Great Lakes area for copper mining. But in addition to the settling of New England, which we might even call New Ireland, because of the origins of the Celts in Massachusetts, New England, and that part of the United States, we see the Celts branching out, going to the interior, making their way to the Mississippi River while documenting the landscape, leaving markers and as they map the territory, and finding their way into the river systems and tributaries of the Mississippi, including the Arkansas River and its tributaries, including the Purgatory and Cimarron rivers. And we see through the river systems, the Celts expanding, into the interior of the United States, including southeastern Colorado, Kansas, and Oklahoma, where the most significant proof and documentation of the Celts in America can be found. And it's not just significant Ogham inscriptions at half a dozen sites, but the archaeoastronomy alignments and animations that accompany these descriptions that make the case, and I'd say the slam dunk case, that proves the Celts were in North America. Not just earlier Celts from perhaps 2,000 years ago, but even later day Europeans like the Welsh that their inscriptions in West Virginia, accompanied by archaeoastronomy alignments. So much of the book deals with the expansion of the Celts and what they left in stone petroglyphs, and what was encoded in those glyphs that reveal, not only that they were here, but in some cases, information that you won't even find in Europe. And an example of what I'm talking about is a site in the panhandle of Oklahoma called Anubis Caves. And Anubis Caves is has 7 caves in eroded sandstone near the Cimarron River. And in these caves, we find Ogham inscriptions honoring the sun god Baal, and also noting Grian in urging the observers to celebrate and prepare for celebrations, but we find extensive archaeoastronomy involving what has been identified as the sun god Mithras, or Mithra, who was celebrated by the Romans in later days, but before then by the Persians. And we see the rites to Mithras documented in the petroglyphs at Anubis Cave, and we see a fantastic Heliolithic animation or light show at sunset on the equinox, where two primary petroglyphs, the sun god Mithras and a canine petroglyph who has been named Anubis, the Egyptian Lord Night or god of the dead. And as the sun goes down and the sun god Mithras goes into shadow, standing above Mithras is the jackal god Anubis, standing in light, representing that it's now, as the sun goes down, it's time for Anubis to take over from Mithras. And these two petroglyphs also show something I think very important, that it's not just but that these ancient mariners were multicultural, with crews made up of many different religions and cultures. So we at Anubis Cave, not only do we have, for example, the Ogham inscriptions, but we also have Libyan writing, a different script. And not only do we have the sun god Mithras, but we have an Egyptian deity, Anubis. So in addition to the encoded messages in the archaeoastronomy and the Ogham inscriptions that talk about Bel and Grian, we have the religion of Mithraism, much of which was evidence was destroyed in Europe. We have it encoded in a cave in North America to provide additional insights on the nature of the religion and how through the archaeoastronomy the cosmology of works. It's quite a phenomenal phenomenal sight to be at a location and see this moving light show, if you will, on these petroglyphs reveal an ancient story.
Wonderful, Carl. Incredibly fascinating stuff, Carl. I like that idea of calling it New Ireland, by the way. That sounds more apt, more accurate in a way. And what you're talking about, Carl, is something that's very dear to me, because I often think about, I've no problem accepting it's more of an interpretation of what the evidence means. And just for the audience, the megalithic builders came before the Celts, and the Celts were all over Europe, coming along the Danube, and they got to Britain, and they got to Ireland, and then they fused with the megalithic people, and they inherited the megalithic monuments. And I think that time frame, Carl, was incredibly interesting, because we think that the Celts go back at least 1500 BC, and there was an overlap of about, say, 500 years between the megalithic guys and the Celts, and that fusion then, the Celts, we know that they were at Noath in County Meath, and they inherited Noath fortress, and I think, they obviously had to have come by boat from Spain, from France, from Brittany, and when they infused with the megalithic guys, I think the megalithic guys were on their way out for some reason, perhaps dwindling numbers, but that fusion, why not? Why can't they go to America, Why can't they take that route up to Scotland and over to Iceland and over to Canada and down into New Hampshire that way? It's not a big reach. The Norwegians did it. Why not? That's such a wonderful, and like you say, the copper mining was a great excuse for them to do that journey. Just a point on the Ogham script, Carl, let's talk about that for a second. This is incredibly important. We only have something like 400 examples of Ogham script in Ireland. Incredibly rare writing. That we have a few more examples in America. It's incredibly telling.
Yes, it is. And before I talk a little about that, I would just, like to expand upon what you noted about how they might have got here in boats. One of the most fascinating reactions I get from people who have looked at the book, Secrets of America, is the first question is, how did they get here? And it's very difficult for moderns to visualize that these ancient mariners, both coming from Europe and the Mediterranean regions, as well as Indus Valley, had very sophisticated shipbuilding technologies, way more so than what Columbus had. These were much larger commercial ships that were outfitted with hundreds of mariners and built to take significant amount of metals back from America to Europe. So our whole perspective of the ancients has been so distorted that that we have to ask, how could they have possibly gotten here, not recognizing that they had much more sophisticated shipbuilding than the Europeans of the time of Columbus and King Ferdinand had. So that's an important point to highlight.
Sure.
As to the examples of Ogham script, I don't, I again want to emphasize that it's not like there's hundreds of examples. Having said that, most of the script in Europe seems to be vertical Ogham that's been written on monuments, and these are lines and broken lines that are a writing system that can be interpreted into Celtic languages, if that's what they were written in. In the case of later day inscriptions in North America, we see old Irish or Welsh, but most of the great examples of Ogham that I find and have documented in the book are located in the interior of the United States, in Colorado, Kansas, and in the Oklahoma Panhandle. And I'd say there are at least a dozen significant and slam dunk evidence that the Celts were here because of the Ogham marks that can be read in Celtic. I would add that it's a controversial field. Throughout the studying rock art, we find many examples, thousands and thousands of Ogham-like inscriptions, that is, using lines that look like Ogham, but clearly most of these are not Ogham. They're either copied by Native Americans, or they're counts, or they have some other use. But at the archaeoastronomy sites, such as Crack Cave in Colorado, we do see very well formed Ogham, and the Ogham, it refers to the rites of equinox. The phrase in Crack Cave reads in Celtic, "The sun strikes here on the day of Bel," and sure to the form of the inscription. Leading up to the equinox, you see the sun grazing the side of the inner cave wall where the inscription is, and they have tick marks accompanying the inscription to give the viewer a specific reference to how many days before and how many days after the equinox. So it's a calendrical device. But on the equinox itself, we have a very precise alignment that will only be seen on the equinox, where the sun comes into the cave, graces the inscriptions, and right where the inscription reads, "The sun strikes on the equinox." And when you have this kind of validation of the Ogham script in an archaeoastronomical alignment, I consider that to be proof. And in addition to Crack Cave, and in addition to Anubis Cave, where we have more inscriptions, again, invoking the sun god, invoking the worshipers to prepare for celebrations. We also have in Colorado a site called Sun Temple, a cross-quarter day alignment that is that was aligned for the Lunasa, the harvest, first harvest festival of the Celts, which falls in early August. And this is somewhat of a departure from Native American petroglyphs and archaeoastronomy, using the cross-quarter days as opposed to just the equinox. And at Sun Temple, we are able to interpret the Ogham inscriptions in Celtic, and Lunasa is the celebration of the sun god Lu. And we don't know too much more about Lu because the Christians did such a great job of erasing him from the collective memory, but he is preserved in the cross-quarter day Lunasa, so we know a little about him, and there are some monuments and artifacts attributed to the worship of Lu. But at the Sun Temple, we actually see Ogham writing that talks about Lunasa as the harvest festival, and also paraphrase one of the Ogham inscriptions, a time for sports and sporting events. So they were not just celebrating Lu as a harvest festival, but apparently they also had their sporting events. So being able to be at a cross-quarter site on Lunasa, validating the Celtic presence in America, is really so revealing as to the breadth of the ancients and what still remains in North America, evidence of their presence here.
We still celebrate up in my part of the world here in north of Ireland, in Antrim, the old Lammas Fair. They celebrate it on Lunacy. It's the Lunacy Fair. Still celebrated today. But yeah, these cross-quarter days, for me, Carl, we don't see that widespread across the rest of the world. There seems to be a megalithic Ireland, or a European, Western European megalithic compound to their culture. The fact that there's so many cross-quarter days and their cosmology of it there, Carl, it's incredibly telling for me. It's the icing on the cake, as they say, and incredibly indicative. Carl, do you think perhaps that there was a migration, maybe backwards and forwards between Ireland, Britain, or Western Europe and Eastern America, and then perhaps when the time of the Romans come, or other invading tribes and stuff like that, that there was groups of people just stayed on in America, that they just stayed there. They just went, oh, well, okay, there's no point in going back, we're getting invaded. So they just already had their escape route there, and you just ceased contact after that.
Well, I think there's a little more to the story in that, a lot of the explorations were driven by search for gold, and especially copper in Michigan, but gold and silver in the West in California. But also, I think we see migrations coming to the Americas as a result of cataclysmic disasters and political unrest. So there were some other motivations for the Old World travelers coming to the New World. Mm-hmm. In the case of the discontinuing of contact mm-hmm. between Europe and the Americas, after the Romans conquered the Celts, one of the points that Barry Fell makes in America BC is that a strategy of the Romans in conquering peoples was to destroy their navies and their merchant marines. And I think this was the primary reason that transportation and communication between the Old World and the New World ended, that they just didn't have the ships going back and forth anymore. And those Celts that had settled here quickly became either integrated into Native American tribes, and there is evidence of this presented in the book, or completely wiped out by Native Americans who saw them as a threat. So that one of the really mysteries of our history is, what happened to these explorers? And there's not a simple answer, but there is a sufficient body of evidence that many of these settlers or explorers ended up being integrated Native American tribes, and that we can see in looking at specific tribes, old world languages, old world words that show up in the languages, symbols, and even customs that some of these tribes still carry forth. I'm not trying to suggest that the Native Americans originated with the Celts or anything like that. Clearly, the ancestors to the Native Americans, many of them, most of them came across the Bering Straits and the land bridge and came down through North America into Central America and South America, as we've been taught. But what we have not been taught is that we also see migrations of Europeans, Mediterraneans, and Africans coming across the Atlantic, and Indo-Turkish, Indo-European, as well as greater Indus Valley people coming across the Pacific that clearly had some influences on some of the tribes, including customs, words, and symbols.
Sure. Carl, let's go for the Phoenicians next. This, for me, is one of the hottest little subjects on the board at the moment. I mean, nobody can take away from the Phoenicians. These guys were master mariners. If there was anybody guaranteed to be in America, it was the Phoenicians. These guys were bold. They were incredibly bold. They went out to face the seas. They were revered in their own day as master mariners. Most likely, probably the guys that were sourcing this copper, the original people that were sourcing this copper and getting it into Europe.
Well, there is a really strong case to be made of the Phoenician migrations, including writing in stone in New England, and that Dr. Fell has documented. And in one case, we have an inscription that says something to the effect of this is a landing place for Phoenician boats. There's a whole body of speculation about other evidence, but one of the most compelling bits of evidence of the Phoenicians could be found in Ecuador, in the art collection of a Father Carlo Crespi, who has now died, but he amassed a huge collection of native artifacts, but also artifacts of foreign origin, and this included gold plates with old world inscriptions that can likely be attributed to the Phoenicians. So even though the older these cultures get, like the Phoenicians, and the less evidence there's a significant body of evidence both in inscriptions and in artifacts that the Phoenicians made it here, and as I alluded, quite likely with a diverse multicultural crews coming to America. I would also suggest that the Phoenicians were not only the greatest mariners at the time and had the largest fleet of merchant marines, but they did their best to keep the how to get here and where to go secret. Eventually, the information got out. But if you were a Celtic group of merchants, or you were a Hebrew group of merchants, it might have been unlikely you had the resources or the technology or the knowledge of where to go to get to America and back. And this is there's evidence that these groups and cultures contracted with the Phoenicians and the Phoenician mariners to come to America and back. And in this regard, the Phoenicians were really the greatest merchants, and innovators of developing these communication links and transportation links to the New World.
Wow. Tell me about Serpent Mound. I've never been, Carl. I've never been to America. When I do get there, which I will very, very soon, I think, maybe this year or the next, but as soon as I get there, I'm going to make 2 stops. I'll probably fly New York or Boston, and I'll definitely be stopping at America's Newgrange and America's Stonehenge, for example. But Serpent Mound is definitely on the list. I find this such a fascinating, tantalizing monument to marvel at or to research, or either or. What's your findings of Serpent Mound, Carl? Do you see links with Europe? Do you see this is a megalithic monument?
Well, the Europeans are familiar with giant earthworks, and what we see in America are many different giant earthworks. Most of them probably left, by the Native Americans, and the largest of these earthworks is the Serpent Mound, which is over 1,000 feet long, and it's a serpent, 3 feet high, and I believe 6 to 8 feet wide. It's something that you can see very clearly from the air. And what distinguishes this earthwork is that it's a serpent with a open mouth and a disc in its mouth, and this is replicated throughout North America with at least a dozen examples of smaller earthworks showing the same motif of a serpent disc in its mouth. So what is the origin of this metaphor? What is the origin of a serpent with a disc in its mouth? Still remains a mystery. But what I document later in the book at a site in California that I attribute to Indus Valley culture is a petroglyphic animation involving a small egg oracle with 4 circles, spirals around it, and it on the equinox, as the sun rises, we see a light dagger or a light image that is very similar to a serpent with a open mouth, or a light serpent. And as the sun rises, this image of a light serpent moves across the panel and conjuncts with or meets this petroglyphic circle, which a collaborator, Rod Schmidt, dubbed an egg or a disc. And on the equinox, the open jaw of the light serpent moving across the panel consumes this inner egg. And before the equinox, it's going to miss it a little, and after the equinox, it's going to miss it. So it was clearly an alignment for the equinox, and we have an incredible story unfolding with light and shadow and petroglyphs of a serpent consuming a disc or an egg. The exact same motif that we see at the Serpent Mound and found in many other sites throughout North America, mostly attributed, I would say, with the exception of the site in California, almost in every case, probably attributed to the ancestors of the Native Americans. So we don't have an answer what came first, but we do know that this the motif of the Serpent Mound is integral to the ancient Native Americans, and we see it documented probably first at a site in California that has all the attributes of an old world petroglyphic site, replete with over 12 archaeoastronomical animations, including significant cross-quarter day alignments and heliolithic animations. So it's not that my book, Secrets of America, is able to completely say what the meaning of the serpent mound and what the motif of a serpent with a sun or a disc or an egg in its mouth is, but we find it both at an ancient Old World site from Indus Valley in California, and we find it throughout America as a major motif of Native Americans. So I urge you to go to the Serpent Mound. It's phenomenal, but note, just like in the case of Europe, there are multiple earthworks found throughout North America that again, we're just kind of, some of them beginning to find now as we can look down and from airplanes and see some of the messages left by the ancients for us.
Sure. Carl, we're at the top of the hour. I guess one last question before we do. Take a moment to give us out your website, Carl, one more time for the listeners.
Yes, at newhistoryofamerica.com, there's a little background on me in the book. You can purchase a book at the site www.newhistoryofamerica.com. And for those interested in my pursuits in renewable energy and biorefining, I'd encourage you to visit purevisiontechnology.com to learn more about our biorefining technologies and biorefining industrial hemp at www.purevisiontechnology.com.
Oh, wonderful, Carl. And, we're talking about secrets of ancient America, archaeoastronomy, and the legacy of the Phoenicians, Celts, and other forgotten explorers. Incredibly well-researched, well-written, well-articulated, Carl. So much information in there, 400 plus pages for the audience. You're going to get so much value out of this book. This is the book to buy. And I want to give that a serious endorsement because it's just wonderful, Carl. It's just, you can tell it took a lot of time to research and put this together. And so I just commend you on that, first of all. But I guess, do you see this as a paradigm changer, Carl? Do you see maybe that's a big task for anybody to change? Do you think it's going to be another lifetime before we change the paradigm of the public?
Well, truth be known, that was why I wrote the book, but it's an uphill battle. Previous researchers, certainly more articulate and with background in some areas of astronomy and epigraphy, have come before me and have not changed the paradigm, including, Barry Fell, who I mentioned, Cyrus Gordon, who wrote before Columbus, Gallagher and Dexter, who wrote Contact with Ancient America, Roland Gillespie, the list goes on. And in spite of great research and what I'd call documentation, including some of these Celtic sites that were researched and documented by my mentors, Philip Leonard and William McGlone, who wrote Ancient American Inscriptions, no one seems to have broken through the paradigm. We're still celebrating Columbus. We still can imagine how the Celts and Mediterranean peoples got to America thousands of years before Columbus, and we don't recognize Old World sites when we come across them. So the hope was that this book would contribute to changing the paradigm. And as you know, James, it's all about timing, and we can hope that with the changing paradigm in many of the other scientific areas, that we have an opportunity to look at a new history of America and accelerate the research by epigraphers, archaeologists, and anthropologists who heretofore have not really taken a serious look at diffusionist scholars, diffusionist research that, as my book does, I think proves that the Celts were here along with Roman travelers, Hebrews, and Old World peoples from both sides of the America, the Atlantic, and the Pacific.
Sure.
So I'm hopeful, but I have to be guardedly optimistic given the strength of the archaeo priesthood today.
Sure. Not to bash the academics too much, Carl, but do you think perhaps that there's maybe not deliberate, let's not get too conspiratorial, but maybe the academics have this breeding program where they breed ignorance just because that's the environment that they're in? Do you think that's something we have to come over, this ignorance of the evidence?
Well, I'm very hopeful that a new generation of researchers and archaeologists will somehow be able to get beyond the gatekeepers of academia and somehow break through so that when we open up the National Geographic and the Smithsonian that up to this point have never really seriously dealt with this topic, we will find an article one day on America's Stonehenge and we will find articles documenting the Celts in Colorado and Oklahoma at some archaeoastronomy sites. But really, until then, it's going to be an uphill battle. And like I say, I'm hopeful that in our lifetime we're going to see some success. But I would just conclude by noting what Roland Gillespie said, and he was a NASA scientist and an archaeoastronomer. And people can see an interview of Roland Gillespie at www.archaeological.com, a great site. But what Roland said was, in talking about Celts in Oklahoma and Colorado, that it was going to take at least a generation, before science and archaeology was going to accept them. Regrettably, it's taken at least 2, and now we're going on 3 generations. So, in this world, nothing seems to be happening too quickly. However, with the internet, with radio shows like Capricorn Radio, more and more people are getting educated, and I'm hopeful that a bottom-up movement on the academic level and in schools, where professors and teachers may not be so willing to step up, but it's going to be the students demanding different textbooks and the ability to cover diffusionist topics in the classroom that will contribute to a changing of the paradigm.
Well said, Carl. Well said. Well, you've been listening to today's author, Carl Lehrburger, and we've been talking about his latest book, Secrets of Ancient America. Of course, you can get a copy of that at newhistoryofamerica.com. And what an awesome book it is, well illustrated, well documented, and the organization process will open the doors for industrial hemp. Fascinating area of research, Carl.
Well, thank you, and it's I think it's a new day here in America.
Yeah, for sure. Great to see that science background, Carl. This is very pertinent to what we're going to talk about today, archaeoastronomy. Before we get into details, I mean, you know what? I actually think archaeoastronomy in certain circumstances is more accurate than some of the archaeological dating. I mean, archaeoastronomy is a very specific dating tool, Carl.
Well, it certainly can be, and I think the European perspective somewhat predates the Americans right now in understanding that archaeoastronomy is really one of the major languages of the ancients. And for so long, we've had archaeologists traveling the Americas, looking down and digging and looking for artifacts without looking up and understanding that the ancients encoded many of their monuments as well as their petroglyphs with archaeo and astronomical information that is very revealing, not only in terms of potentially the dating, but most importantly the culture and the origins of the inscribers of these petroglyphs and the builders of these monuments. Unlike Europe, where we have a tremendous amount of monumental structures that encode archaeoastronomy, including Stonehenge and Newgrange, which I feature in the book. In America, while we do have some monumental examples of old world peoples building.
This is the analytical, creative mind looking at the problems of what we're going to talk about today, but in a vocation sense.
Oh, well, thank you for that great introduction. And I'm glad to begin this interview by talking about my background in renewable energy because it really provides, I think, the reader a perspective that I've taken a scientific approach and not just like many scholars and authors on the topic of the ancients from Europe and the Mediterranean visiting America long before Columbus. My teachers really have been grounded in engineering science, and I've tried to bring a very critical eye to looking at the diffusionism in America, and especially being able to document the evidence, so that it's very clear that we're not talking about, in many instances, suppositions, but in fact we're talking about events that did occur and have evidence. And by way of background, I've been working in the renewable energy area for over 40 years, including work in solar energy, waste management, and recycling, and most recently in biorefining, that is taking non-food biomass like corn stalks and agricultural residues and converting them into a whole array of bioproducts, ranging from pulp and paper products to specialty chemicals, nutraceuticals, and even
Hi everybody, welcome back to Capricorn Radio. This is your host James, and I'm delighted to be talking to a super interesting guy today. We're going to be talking to Carl Lehrburger. And for those that know about Carl, a little bit about him before I bring him on. He has studied archaeological and sacred sites in North America with a focus on ancient world peoples in America before Columbus for more than 25 years. He has published articles on rock art sites in Ancient American magazine, a renewable energy entrepreneur, avid traveler and explorer. He lives in Talent, Oregon. For more information on the book and the author, can visit newhistoryofamerica.com. So we're going to get into a little more of Carl's bio before we get into the book. But the book today is super exciting. Secrets of Ancient America, Archaeoastronomy and the Legacy of the Phoenicians, Celts and Other Forgotten Explorers. It delves into the real history of the New World and the both East and West, who travelled to America long before 1492, the fabled visit by Columbus. So, without further ado, let's bring on today's guest. Hi, Carl. You're very welcome to the show.
Hi, James, and greetings to Capricorn Radio listeners around the world.
Thank you, Carl. And yeah, wow, super exciting today. Super exciting to have you here, Carl. And you know, nice to see Newgrange and my part of the world focused on in the book as well. I'm so excited, Carl. But before we get into any of that, and I love the book, by the way, absolutely love that. One of my favourite books I've reviewed this year, Carl, by the way. But before we get into that, Carl, it's always about the author first. We kind of have a similar background in renewable energy, so although mine was a bit of an industrial engineering route, but I'm fascinated with renewables. Tell me about that part of your life, Carl. This is incredibly interesting to see you see this perhaps
monuments and large structures that have archaeoastronomical aspects to them. Most of what we see here in North America are petroglyphic archaeoastronomy.
Sure.
That is, that the sun and shadow play at specific times of year, including the equinoxes and the solstices, and of course the cross-quarter days, which we'll talk about a little later, are encoded in petroglyphs. And in some cases we actually see what I call in the book heliolithic animations, or light shows, where the dancing and moving shadows and light show up on these petroglyphs to reveal a story. So it's a very exciting new tool over here in which to reevaluate a lot of the rock art that heretofore has all been considered to be done by the Native Americans. When in the case of Secrets of Ancient America, the book, I've been able to document a scant, although maybe a dozen or so instances where the rock art does have Old World origins.
incredible, Carl. Love the book, by the way. Beautiful book, so much in it, Carl. I mean, it must have took you quite a while to compile all this stuff.
Well, it was about 20 years of research and field work and 7 years of writing. Barry Fell, Dr. Fell was a biologist at the Harvard Museum. he first wrote biofuels. Most recently, you'll find this interesting, James, we founded a subsidiary company, Pure Hemp Technology, which is focused entirely on processing industrial hemp, not marijuana, but industrial hemp, into a new generation of hemp-based products. As you may know, the mood in the United States is rapidly changing, as many states led by Oregon and Colorado have legalized marijuana, and over 22 states are now starting production of industrial hemp, a very strong industry right up till 1930s in the United States when it was banned. So it's almost back to the future, and we are pursuing the biorefining of industrial hemp. Just to provide the listeners with additional information if they choose, more information on Pure Vision can be found at purevisiontechnology.com, and more information on our efforts to scale up a biorefining technology for industrial hemp can be found at purehemptech.com, P-U-R-E, hemp, T-E-C-H.com.
Oh, wonderful, Carl. And yeah, that's incredibly fascinating, and it's a lucrative product as well. I mean, people don't realize how versatile hemp is. I mean, there was probably no need for half our plastics industry. I mean, it's so versatile. You can make clothing out of it. It's extremely strong fiber. And the problem has been, because of the associated cannabis plant, that it's really inhibited the use of industrial hemp. It seems bizarre and crazy that that's the way our society has gone, but it's that legal